The city of New York was waking up under a grey sky that seemed to reflect the weight of the moment. It was 7:53 a.m. when Robert Miller parked his black sedan in front of the corner bakery in the heart of Park Avenue. His hands trembled as he turned off the engine, not from the chill of the June morning, but from what he was about to do. Inside the worn leather briefcase beside him, documents that felt heavier than lead awaited a single signature. His signature. The one that would decree the end of everything. Robert got out of the car with the slowness of a man walking to his own sacrifice. He wore a navy blue suit that no longer fit him as well as it once did, a reflection of months of insomnia and forgotten meals. At 52, the man who had once commanded hundreds of employees and erected skyscrapers that touched the Manhattan skyline now carried the weight of defeat on his shoulders. His sunken eyes betrayed the sleepless nights spent calculating and recalculating numbers that never added up, searching for exits in mazes with no doors. The bakery was buzzing with the morning rush. Robert knew so well. It was here years ago that he had celebrated signing the biggest contract in his construction company's history. Here, where he had toasted with cheap champagne and warm bagels the day he won a city contract to build 3 public schools in Queens. This place had witnessed his victories, and now it would be the stage for his final surrender. There was a cruel irony in that which did not escape him. As he entered, the aroma of fresh coffee and baking bread filled his nostrils. The place was packed with people in a hurry, grabbing breakfast before work. Executives in ties, students with heavy backpacks, retired seniors savoring their first coffee of the day. Life was going on as normal for everyone who wasn't about to sign their own ruin. Robert looked for the table in the back, the same one he always took. It was a more private corner away from the bustle of the counter, where he could have the privacy needed for what was to come. He sat down heavily in the wooden chair, which creaked under his weight. He opened the briefcase with mechanical movements and spread the documents across the Formica tabletop. Contracts, balance sheets, debt statements, bank notices. Each paper was a sentence, each number a conviction. Miller Construction, founded 28 years ago with just 2 calloused hands and an oversized dream, was about to cease to exist. And with it, a part of Robert he didn't know how to get back would also die. His cell phone vibrated. An automatic payment reminder. Robert barely glanced at it. There were no more texts from friends, no more calls from the board he himself had assembled and which had abandoned him in recent months. His CFO had resigned 3 months ago, claiming the ship was sinking and he had a family to support. His executive assistant, who had been by his side for 15 years, cried as she handed in her resignation letter, saying she couldn't bear to watch the company fall apart anymore. One by one, they all left. And Robert didn't blame them. If he could, he would run away from himself. The server hurried by and Robert ordered an espresso without looking up. His mind was trapped in an infinite loop of memories and regrets. He remembered when he bought that first plot of land on the outskirts of the city, when he hired his first helpers, when his wife Marianne still believed in him. Marianne. The thought of her brought a sharp pang to his chest. She had left him 6 months ago, taking Isabella, their only daughter, just 14 years old. The last conversation they had was a cold, direct accusation. "You chose this company over us, Robert. You chose numbers over hugs, meetings over family dinners. I don't recognize the man I married anymore." She was right. Robert knew it. Even now, about to lose everything, the guilt he felt wasn't just for the company's bankruptcy, but for the void he had created in his own home. Isabella barely spoke to him. His calls went to voicemail, his texts went unanswered. He had become a stranger to his own daughter, and that pain was deeper than any financial loss. The coffee arrived, steaming and bitter like the moment. Robert took a sip without tasting it. He looked at the wristwatch Marianne had given him for his 40th birthday. 8:07 a.m. His lawyer, Henry Taylor, would arrive in a few minutes. He had been clear on the phone the night before, his professional, distant voice, leaving no room for hope. "The numbers don't lie, Robert. The debt is unsustainable. 3 different banks, creditors lined up, suppliers suing. Bankruptcy is the only viable option. You need to protect what's left of your personal assets. Robert picked up the pen, a Mont Blanc he had received on the day his company was inaugurated. How many winning contracts had that pen signed? How many paychecks? How many work orders? Now, it would serve to decree the end. His hands trembled again. It wasn't exactly fear. It was something worse. It was the resignation of someone who has given up the fight, who accepts defeat as inevitable. It was the bitter taste of surrender. The bakery continued its rhythm. A child laughed loudly at the counter. The radio played a pop song Robert couldn't identify. Life went on for everyone, indifferent to the personal drama unfolding at that corner table. Robert thought about how strange that was. How could the world keep spinning when his was imploding? How could people smile, order bread, complain about traffic, while he was here, about to sign the death certificate of his dreams? He leafed through the documents one more time, though he already knew every line, every clause by heart. An uncovered liability of $12 million. Assets insufficient to cover half of that. Dismal future projections. No new contracts on the horizon. More agile, better capitalized competitors were already snatching up the few available projects on the market. Miller Construction was, on paper, a financial corpse. All that was missing was the official burial. A single tear rolled down Robert's face, surprising him. He hadn't cried in months. He thought he had no tears left, that his soul had dried up along with his hopes. But there it was, a single stubborn tear that he quickly wiped away with the back of his hand, looking around to make sure no one had seen. He couldn't afford weakness, not here, not now. He had to maintain his composure until the end, even if the end meant the destruction of everything he had fought for. The bell on the door chimed, and Robert looked up instinctively. It wasn't Henry. Just another customer coming in for their morning coffee. Robert turned his eyes back to the documents. The final page was already marked with a yellow sticky tab where he was supposed to sign. Below, the signatures of 2 witnesses were already there. Everything was ready for the finale. Everything was prepared for the end. He just needed to pick up that pen, rest it on the paper, and scrawl his name. Robert Miller. 2 words that meant giving up. 2 words that would end an era. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to find strength. He thought of all the workers he had employed over the years, hundreds of families who had depended on his contracts to put food on the table. Masons, laborers, engineers, architects, assistants, they had all passed through Miller Construction and taken with them not just salaries, but dreams fulfilled. How many houses were bought with the money paid by his company? How many children were sent to college? How many weddings were celebrated thanks to the stability he provided? And now, all of that would end. There would be no more construction sites, no more jobs created, no more pride in seeing a new building with the Miller Construction plaque at the entrance. It would be as if 28 years of hard work had simply evaporated, leaving only debts and bitter memories. Robert felt the weight of that. Responsibility crush his chest. It wasn't just his failure. It was the failure of everyone who had trusted him, of everyone who had believed in the project he had sold with such conviction. The door chimed again. This time Robert didn't look. He was too deep in his thoughts, in his regrets. He kept staring at the documents as if they could magically change their content, as if the numbers could rearrange themselves and present a miraculous solution that all the auditors, accountants, and lawyers had failed to find. But the numbers remained unchanged, cold and relentless in their brutal truth. 8:15 a.m. Henry was late, which was unusual for him. Robert used the extra time for one more mental review of everything that had gone wrong, the economic crisis that shrank the construction market, the poorly calculated investments in properties that depreciated, the over-reliance on contracts that never materialized, the departure of the CFO, which left the company without proper financial command. Every mistake, every wrong decision, paraded through his mind like a horror movie, in which he was both the protagonist and the victim. Robert picked up the pen once more. He brought the tip close to the paper. His fingers gripped the metal body tightly, preparing for the final move. Just sign and end this agony. Just scrawl his name and start accepting the new reality. A reality without the construction company, without the purpose that defined who he was. Robert Miller without Miller Construction, who would he be then? Just a broke, divorced and lonely middle-aged man. Just another one who tried and failed. The pen was millimeters from the paper when a soft voice interrupted Robert's personal silence. "Excuse me, sir. Can I top off your coffee?" Robert looked up, irritated by the interruption. It was a young server, probably in her early 20s, with brown hair pulled back in a messy bun and a white flour-dusted apron. She was holding a coffee carafe and had a gentle smile that contrasted with the harshness of the moment. Robert almost dismissed her with a rude gesture, but something in her eyes made him hesitate. There was an intelligence there, a presence that seemed out of place in that simple uniform. "No, I'm fine, thanks," Robert answered curtly, turning his eyes back to the documents. But the server didn't move. She remained there, standing by the table, coffee carafe in hand, discreetly glancing at the papers spread out. "Sorry to intrude, sir, but I couldn't help but notice these documents when I wiped down the table a little while ago." Her voice had a firmness that surprised Robert. "You're about to sign a bankruptcy petition, aren't you?" Robert felt a wave of indignation rise in his chest. Who did this girl think she was to comment on his personal affairs? He opened his mouth to put her in her place, to tell her it was none of her business, but she spoke first. "I know it's not my place," she said, as if reading his mind. "But before I worked here, I was a financial analyst, and when I came by earlier to clear the tables, I saw some of the numbers on these documents." Her voice dropped a tone, becoming almost conspiratorial. "Sir, with all due respect, I think you're about to make a terrible mistake." Robert blinked, confused. A bakery server who used to be a financial analyst. It sounded absurd, almost insulting. He looked at her skeptically, noticing the flour stains on her apron, her unpolished nails, her worn-out shoes. This was the person who intended to advise him on complex corporate finances. It was almost comical if it weren't so tragic. "Miss, I appreciate your concern, but this is serious business. This is 28 years of my company, millions in debt, and 3 of the best law and accounting firms in New York have reviewed these papers. I think you're a little out of your league." The server didn't seem offended. On the contrary, her eyes shone with a quiet determination. "I know it sounds strange, sir. I know how I must look to you right now, but give me 5 minutes, just 5 minutes before you sign that. What do you have to lose?" Robert was about to refuse. He was about to send her away and get back to his mission of ending this nightmare. But something in that voice, in that unshakable confidence, made him hesitate. Maybe it was desperation, maybe it was intuition, or maybe it was simply the need to postpone the inevitable for a few more minutes. He glanced at his watch. 8:22 a.m. Henry still hadn't arrived. 5 minutes, Robert said, his voice heavy with resignation and disbelief. "You have 5 minutes." The server placed the coffee carafe on an empty chair and, without ceremony, pulled up another chair to sit beside Robert. He noticed how efficiently she moved, how her eyes were already scanning the documents with impressive speed. She picked up the first paper, a balance sheet, and her eyes narrowed in concentration. "My name is Julia," she said without taking her eyes off the documents. "Julia Mendez. I worked in finance for 5 years, 3 of them in auditing for mid to large-sized companies. I was fired and blacklisted after I refused to falsify reports to cover up an embezzlement scheme for my boss. I ended up here because no one else in the field will hire me." Robert felt a tightness in his chest. There was a brutal honesty in those words, a pain he recognized. It was the pain of someone who lost everything for doing the right thing, of someone punished for their integrity. He knew that pain, though his came from his own mistakes, not virtues. Julia continued flipping through the documents with a speed that showed her familiarity with this type of material. Her fingers glided over the pages, her eyes capturing numbers and clauses with the precision of someone who had done this thousands of times. Robert watched, torn between absurd hope and protective skepticism. How could this young woman, serving coffee in a bakery, see something that entire teams of professionals had missed? "Here," Julia said suddenly, placing her finger on a specific item under liabilities. This industrial warehouse out in New Jersey, 8 million in debt. She quickly grabbed another document. And here, this commercial property, also 8 million. Sir, are these two items the same asset? Robert frowned and pulled the papers closer. He read the descriptions. The warehouse off the New Jersey Turnpike. Exit 15, the commercial property in the same general area. His heart began to beat faster. Could it be possible? They were different loans, Robert said, his voice starting to tremble. When we restructured the debts, we took out loans from different banks. One treated it as an industrial warehouse, the other as a commercial property for different tax purposes. But it's the same place. Julia nodded gravely. Then you have a duplication of liability here. $8 million that doesn't exist. This debt is being counted twice. Her voice was calm but firm. That completely changes the bankruptcy picture. Robert felt as if the floor was moving beneath his feet. $8 million. An absurd duplication, too obvious to be true, and yet there it was, in the official documents, signed by accountants and lawyers. How had no one seen this? How had he not seen it himself? His mind began to work quickly, recalculating the numbers, rearranging the financial puzzle. Julia didn't give him time to fully process it. She was already on another document, the revenue projections for the current year. And here, sir, these projections. They're based only on last year's contracts, correct? Robert confirmed, with a nod, still stunned by the previous discovery. Julia pointed to a specific line. But what about this contract here on the last page, almost like an appendix? A public works project, a public school in downtown Brooklyn, signed 3 months ago, 17 million over 24 months. Robert's eyes widened. That contract. He vaguely remembered signing it, already in the midst of the crisis, already without hope. It had been one of his last acts before seriously considering bankruptcy. A small contract by the company's standards, but it represented a steady cash flow for the next 2 years, and it was completely absent from the financial projections that formed the basis of the bankruptcy petition. No one included this in the projections, Robert murmured, incredulous. The team that did the calculations didn't know about this contract, or they forgot, or the document never reached them. 17 million in guaranteed revenue, Julia said, her voice gaining intensity. That doesn't save everything, sir, but it radically changes the company's solvency. With 8 million of duplicated liability removed and 17 million of revenue added, you don't have an inevitable bankruptcy. You have a manageable crisis. Robert felt his head spin. Those words, a manageable crisis, were like oxygen to a drowning man. He looked at Julia with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. How was this woman, in 5 minutes, dismantling his company's death sentence? Julia didn't stop. She picked up another set of documents, the asset listings. Here the heavy machinery, backhoes, cranes, concrete mixers, all listed as still being financed, with outstanding payments. She looked directly at Robert. Sir, when was the last time you personally reviewed the status of these loans? Robert tried to remember. It had been before his CFO left, certainly, maybe 6, 7 months ago. Everything was automated. The payments came directly out of the company account. He never questioned it, never checked. He had trusted the system, his subordinates, the processes that had always worked. Julia took her cell phone out of her apron pocket. With your permission, she said, and Robert nodded, still in shock. She typed quickly, accessing what looked like a public records search system. Look here, sir. This equipment was fully paid off 4 months ago. Your last CFO paid everything off before he left, probably trying to clean house. But the record was never updated in the accounting. You're declaring a debt of $3.5 million that no longer exists. Robert felt a wave of emotions so intense he could barely breathe. Anger for being so negligent. Hope for discovering the situation wasn't as desperate as it seemed. Relief for not having signed those documents yet. And gratitude, a deep, inexplicable gratitude for this stranger who had appeared out of nowhere to save what he thought was lost. Julia organized the documents into separate piles, her movements precise and professional. Mr. Miller, she said, and it was the first time she used his name, though he couldn't. Remember telling her, "From what I see here, you don't need to file for bankruptcy. You need a serious administrative reorganization, a full audit, a restructuring plan, negotiations with creditors based on the real numbers, but not this." She pointed to the bankruptcy petition. "This is like burning the whole house down just because it needs a renovation." The metaphor hit Robert hard. That was exactly it. He was about to destroy everything because the numbers presented to him painted a picture of inevitable destruction. But those numbers were wrong, dangerously wrong, and in his exhaustion and despair, he hadn't had the mental clarity to question, to review, to seek a second opinion outside the circle of professionals who had already decided on the easiest path. The bell on the door chimed again, and this time Robert looked up instinctively. His stomach tightened. It was Henry Taylor, his lawyer, walking into the bakery with his expensive leather briefcase and impeccable suit. And next to him, to Robert's complete surprise, was Marianne, his ex-wife, dressed in black, as if already in mourning for the company, with an expression of cold resignation on her face. Robert felt his heart race as he saw Marianne walk into the bakery alongside Henry. She shouldn't be here. Her presence at this moment made no sense. They had been divorced for months, the papers signed, the assets divided. Why would she come to witness the company's funeral? Unless there was something more. Henry spotted Robert and gave a brief nod, walking toward the table with Marianne trailing behind. The lawyer had that professional, distant posture he always maintained, but there was a tension in his shoulders that Robert recognized. Marianne avoided looking directly at her ex-husband, her eyes fixed on some indefinite point above his head. She was thinner, Robert noticed, and there was a sadness in her features that had once been only anger. Julia quickly stood up from her chair, picking up the coffee carafe and taking a step back, as if she understood her presence would be inappropriate at that moment. But Robert gently took her arm. "No, stay," he said in a low voice. "You need to be here." "Good morning, Robert," Henry greeted formally, extending his hand. "I see you got here early. Excellent. We can get this over with quickly and you can start rebuilding your life." He glanced at Julia with brief curiosity, but didn't ask who she was. Marianne finally looked at Robert, and in her gaze were so many layers of emotion that he almost had to look away. There was hurt, disappointment, but also something that looked like concern. "I thought I should be here," she said, her voice softer than he expected. "After all, it was 28 years of our lives too. Somehow, I felt I needed to say goodbye with you." Robert swallowed hard. Marianne's presence made everything more real, more painful. She had witnessed the birth of that company, been by his side. During the late nights, he spent drawing up plans on the kitchen table, celebrated every victory, consoled every defeat, until the victories became more important than her, until the company became the mistress that destroyed their marriage. "Henry," Robert began, his voice coming out firmer than he expected. "Before we sign anything, I need you to review a few points that have been raised." He gestured to the documents Julia had organized. "This young woman, Julia Mendez, a former financial analyst, has found serious inconsistencies in the documents." Henry raised an eyebrow, his face a mixture of surprise and professional skepticism. "Inconsistencies. Robert, these documents were reviewed by 3 different accountants and 2 law firms. They were audited by our team. What exactly is being questioned?" Julia stepped forward, her flour-dusted apron a stark contrast to the lawyer's $3,000 suit. But when she spoke, her voice had an authority that transcended her appearance. "Mr. Taylor, with all due respect, there's a duplication of liability in item 8.3 regarding the industrial warehouse. The same asset is listed twice under different classifications, totaling $16 million when it should be $8. Furthermore, the revenue projections completely ignore an existing $17 million contract. And the heavy machinery is listed as financed when it was fully paid off 4 months ago." The silence that followed was thick. Henry looked at Julia as if she had just spoken in a foreign language. Marianne frowned, confused but curious. The lawyer took the documents Julia had arranged and began to flip through them, his professional expression starting to crack at the edges. "That's impossible," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. A duplication of this magnitude? Our team would have caught it. He continued reading, and Robert saw the exact moment doubt settled in the lawyer's eyes. Wait, this warehouse here? He pulled out another document. And this commercial property? Same address, same square footage. My God. Marianne moved closer to the table, her curiosity overcoming her discomfort. What's going on? She looked at Robert. What is she talking about? Robert felt a surge of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Marianne, it seems the bankruptcy papers contain serious errors. Errors that completely change the company's situation. He looked at Henry. Henry, are you seeing what she's saying? These numbers are wrong. Henry had completely lost his professional composure. He was now hunched over the documents, turning pages frantically, comparing data, his brow furrowed in concentration. Robert, I need to verify this immediately. If what this young woman is saying is true, and the preliminary evidence suggests it is, then this bankruptcy petition is based on incorrect information. He looked at Julia with newfound respect. Miss Mendez, do you have experience in auditing? 5 years, Julia answered calmly. 3 of them specifically with construction companies. I'm very familiar with how assets and liabilities are classified in this sector, and the common pitfalls in debt restructuring involving multiple banks. Marianne was looking from one to the other, trying to process what was happening. So you're saying Robert doesn't have to go bankrupt? That there's a mistake? Her voice carried a complex emotion, as if she didn't know whether to feel relief or frustration for having emotionally prepared for the end. It's not just one mistake, Marianne, Robert said, his voice gaining strength. It's several systematic errors that painted a much darker picture than reality. The company is in crisis, yes, but apparently it's not a terminal one. Henry pulled out his cell phone and started dialing numbers quickly. I'm calling Frank, my partner who specializes in corporate restructuring, and I'll need the auditors here immediately. Robert, don't sign anything yet, absolutely nothing. He glanced at his watch. It's 8:43. I can have a team here in an hour to start an emergency review. The bakery continued its normal hustle and bustle around them, completely oblivious to the drama unfolding at that corner table. The smell of fresh bread mingled with the tension in the air. Robert looked at Julia, who stood there with a serene expression, as if she hadn't just potentially saved an entire company from destruction. How did you know? Robert asked her, his voice low and filled with gratitude. How did you see in 5 minutes what entire teams didn't see in weeks? Julia gave a slight, sad smile. Because I've seen this happen before, Mr. Miller. Because I know how easy it is to miss details when you're reviewing documents under pressure, when there are too many professionals involved and no one does a complete cross-check. Because I was once the person who let a mistake slip by, and it cost me my career. She paused, looking at the documents. I wish someone had checked my work back then. Maybe things would be different. Marianne surprised everyone by pulling up a chair and sitting at the table. Tell me what happened to you, she said to Julia, her voice genuinely interested. How did you go from being a financial analyst to working in a bakery? Julia hesitated, glancing around as if to check if her supervisor was watching. Then, perhaps realizing that this moment transcended her job, she sat down as well. I worked at an investment bank, she began. 5 years climbing the ladder, doing everything right. Until my boss, a senior director, started asking me to adjust reports. Nothing too obvious. At first, just small reclassifications that made certain investments look safer than they were. Henry, who had finished his urgent calls, also pulled up a chair, listening intently. Robert realized that everyone there, in some way, needed to hear this story. They needed to understand who this woman was who had changed the course of their morning. I started to get suspicious after a few months, Julia continued. The numbers didn't add up when I ran my own checks. I discovered he was embezzling money from pension funds, using the reclassifications to hide the holes. When I confronted him, he offered me a promotion and a raise to keep quiet. She looked down at her hands, her unpolished nails calloused from her work at the bakery. I refused. I took everything to the bank's board of directors. And what happened? Marianne asked, though from the context she could already guess the answer. Julia gave a humorless laugh. He had powerful friends. He'd been with the company for 15 years, was well liked by upper management. I was just a 27-year-old analyst making serious accusations. Somehow the narrative got flipped. He accused me of being responsible for the irregularities, of trying to frame him when I got caught. And it worked. I was fired for cause. I sued the bank and I lost. I was blacklisted in the financial industry. No other firm will hire me. Robert felt a deep connection to her story. They had both been destroyed by systems they trusted. He through negligence and mismanagement, she through integrity and courage, but they both ended up in the same place, trying to rebuild shattered lives. "So you came to work here," Robert said, not as a question, but as a conclusion. "I had to survive," Julia replied with a shrug. "The bakery doesn't ask for references from the financial sector. They don't ask tough questions. They pay enough for rent and food, and they let me think while I work." She looked at Robert with a new intensity. "That's why I helped you, you know. Because I wish someone had checked my work back then. I wish someone had seen the mistakes I missed before they cost me everything. Maybe I wouldn't be here today." The bell on the door chimed, and 3 men in suits entered, carrying briefcases and laptops. Henry stood up immediately. "That's my partners and the auditors," he explained. "I'm going to need all the original documents, Robert. We're going to set up an emergency review operation right here." He looked around the bakery. "Or maybe it's better if we go to the office." "No," Robert said firmly. "Here is fine. This is where it all started today. This is where we'll solve it." He looked at the bakery owner, Mr. Benedict, who was watching the commotion with curiosity from behind the counter. "Benedict, we need to use your bakery as an office for a few hours. I can pay for the trouble." Mr. Benedict, a portly, friendly man in his 60s, waved his hand. "Be my guest, Robert. You're an old customer, and from what I gather, Julia here might have just saved your company." He smiled at his employee. "I think she deserves the rest of the day off, don't you?" The next 2 hours transformed the corner bakery into a makeshift financial operations center. 3 tables were pushed together in the back, creating a surface large enough to spread out dozens of documents. Laptops were opened, spreadsheets were typed up frantically, and phone calls were made to banks, county clerks, and government agencies. Mr. Benedict, far from complaining about the occupation, seemed fascinated by the activity and kept a steady supply of fresh coffee coming. Robert watched it all with a mix of anxiety and growing hope. With every minute that passed, with every new document verified, the auditor's expressions shifted from skepticism to perplexity and finally to confirmation. Julia had been right on the money, not just on one point, but on all of them. The errors were all there, glaringly obvious once someone knew where to look. Frank Sullivan, the partner specializing in corporate restructuring, was a man in his 50s, with graying hair and a serious expression that rarely changed. But even he, known for his professional cool, showed disbelief as he reviewed the numbers. "This is extraordinary," he said aloud to no one in particular. "A systemic failure of basic checks and balances. How did this get past so many professionals?" Henry was visibly embarrassed. It was his firm that had coordinated the preparation of the documents, his reputation on the line. Robert could see the internal struggle on the lawyer's face between defending his work and accepting the monumental error. To his credit, integrity won out. "We were careless," he admitted, his voice laced with frustration at himself. "Each team worked on its part in isolation. The accountants reviewed the numbers they were given, we reviewed the legal aspects, but no one did a full integration of the data. We assumed the previous work was correct." "It's what always happens in complex cases," Julia said, her voice soft but firm. "No one wants to look incompetent by questioning someone else's work. No one wants to be the one to raise their hand and say something doesn't make sense. Especially when there's time pressure and the client is already desperate." She looked at Robert. It wasn't bad faith on anyone's part, it was just a perfect storm of factors. Marianne, who had remained silent for a long time just observing, finally spoke. "And what if you hadn't been here today, Julia? What if you hadn't seen the documents when you wiped the table?" Her voice had a strange quality, as if she were contemplating the weight of chance. Robert would have signed. It all would have been over, based on a statistical lie. The thought made everyone pause for a moment. Robert felt a chill run down his spine. How could his entire life be destroyed by administrative errors? How could 28 years of work evaporate because of poorly organized spreadsheets and accountants who didn't talk to each other? It was terrifying and somehow absurdly unjust. Julia took off her apron, folding it neatly over the back of a chair. Mr. Benedict nodded that it was fine, that she should enjoy her time off. She sat down again next to Robert, now out of her bakery uniform, looking more like the professional she once was. "Mr. Miller," she said, "I need you to understand something important. These errors change. The viability picture, yes, but your company is still in crisis. There are still real debts, still cash flow problems. What we discovered today isn't a magic solution. It's just a chance to fight." Robert nodded slowly. He wasn't a fool. He knew that even with the corrected numbers, the road ahead would be difficult. But the difference between impossible and difficult was the distance between giving up and having hope. It was the difference between signing his own sentence and having a chance, however small, to turn the game around. "How much time do we have?" Robert asked Frank. "If we withdraw the bankruptcy petition, how long until the creditors start closing in again?" Frank consulted his documents. "With the corrected numbers, we can file for Chapter 11 protection instead of liquidation. That gives you protection for up to 2 years to restructure. You'll have to present a repayment plan, negotiate with each creditor, prove economic viability. But it's doable, especially with that $17 million contract guaranteeing monthly revenue." 2 years, Robert repeated, letting the words sink in. 2 years to rebuild. 2 years to prove that Miller Construction wasn't finished, just shaken. He looked at Marianne, and in her eyes he saw something he hadn't seen in a long time. It wasn't love. They were past that point. But there was respect, an admiration for the fact that he hadn't signed, that he had listened to Julia when it would have been easier to ignore her. One of the auditors, a young man with glasses named Peter, timidly raised his hand. "Mr. Miller, we found another item that might help. That undeveloped lot in the Bronx that's been sitting idle for 3 years. It seems another construction company is interested in a joint venture. They sent a formal proposal 2 months ago, but apparently it was never answered." Robert frowned, trying to remember. The Bronx. Yes, there was a piece of land he'd bought at an auction years ago, planning to develop a residential complex. But the crisis hit, and the project was shelved. "You're saying someone wants to partner on it now?" Peter turned his laptop to show the emails. "Horizon Builders. They're proposing to put up the construction capital. You provide the land. A 50-50 split on the profits. Their project forecasts sales of $32 million over 18 months. Robert felt as if he were finding forgotten money in the pocket of an old coat. Another opportunity that was just sitting there, hidden in the administrative mess his company had become in the last chaotic months. How many other important things had gone unnoticed while he was sinking in despair? Henry made a note. "I'll contact Horizon Builders today. If the offer is still on the table, this adds another strong element to the recovery plan." He looked at Robert with a serious expression. "Robert, you have a real chance of getting out of this, but it's going to require iron discipline. You'll need impeccable financial management. And frankly, you'll need someone who does what Miss Mendez did today. Check everything, question everything, assume nothing." All eyes turned to Julia. She became visibly uncomfortable with the attention. "I just did the basics of an audit," she said modestly. "Any competent analyst would have seen these inconsistencies." "But they didn't," Marianne said, her voice soft but incisive. 3 teams of expensive, experienced professionals didn't see it. But you did. In 5 minutes, while clearing a table in a bakery, she looked at Robert with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. "I think you know what you need to do, Robert." Robert knew. The idea had been forming in his mind since Julia started pointing out the errors. But there were so many complications, so many obstacles. How could he offer a job to someone he barely knew? How could he trust a stranger with the future of his company? And yet, how could he not trust the person who had just saved it? "Julia," Robert began, choosing his words carefully, "you said you were blacklisted in the financial industry, that no company will hire you because of the false accusations." He paused, taking a deep breath. "What? if you didn't have to work for anyone else? What if you worked directly for me? Julia looked at him with genuine surprise. Mr. Miller, I appreciate the offer, but I don't have credentials anymore. I was fired for cause. I lost my lawsuits. My name is tarnished. No bank will accept reports signed by me. No auditor will give me any credibility. Then we won't ask for their credibility, Robert said, his voice gaining conviction. I'm going to create a position, Director of Financial Integrity. Someone who reports directly to me, who has the autonomy to question any number, any decision, any document. Someone whose only job is to ensure that what happened today never happens again. He looked deep into her eyes. You don't need credentials for me, Julia. You've already proven your worth. Frank leaned forward, interested. Actually, Robert, that's brilliant. One of the weak points in your Chapter 11 filing would be the lack of robust internal controls. If you present a renewed governance structure with someone specifically responsible for financial integrity, the judges will look on it favorably. It shows you're serious about reorganizing. But I don't have experience in construction, Julia protested, though her voice already showed she was considering the possibility. I worked with investments, funds, stocks. It's a different world. You spent 3 years auditing construction companies, Henry reminded her, and you demonstrated today that you perfectly understand how assets and liabilities are classified in the sector. Besides, what Robert needs isn't engineering expertise. He needs someone who understands numbers, who questions reports, who isn't afraid to say when something is wrong. He looked at her with respect. You are exactly what this company needs. Marianne surprised them all by placing her hand on Julia's. I know what it's like to lose. Everything, she said softly. I lost my marriage because Robert chose the company over me and Isabella. But looking at you now, seeing what you did, I realize there might be different kinds of courage. You had the courage to do the right thing when it cost you your career. And today you had the courage to speak up when it would have been easier to stay quiet and just serve coffee. She looked at Robert. If you're going to work with him, you'll need that same courage to say no when he's making mistakes. He's stubborn, he's a workaholic, and he has a hard time admitting when he's wrong. Robert wasn't offended. Marianne was right, and he knew it. That was exactly why he needed someone like Julia, someone who wouldn't be afraid to confront him, to question his decisions, to point out when he was slipping back into work at the expense of everything else. Julia was silent for a long moment, looking at the documents spread across the table, then at Robert, then at her own hands. Finally, she looked up, and Robert saw in her eyes a determination mixed with vulnerability. How long would I have to prove my worth before you decide it was a mistake to hire me? As long as you need, Robert answered honestly. But I want you to know that for me, you've already proven it. Today, in this bakery, you saved more than a company. You saved lives, the hundreds of families that depend on Miller Construction. And you saved me from making the biggest mistake of my life. It was almost noon when the emergency audit was finally completed. The June sun streamed through the bakery windows, illuminating the table now covered with reorganized documents marked up with colored pens. The auditors had worked methodically, verifying every item Julia had pointed out and searching for other potential errors. The final result was simultaneously devastating and hopeful. Peter, the youngest auditor, presented the preliminary report with a voice that tried to remain professional, but couldn't hide its astonishment. Mr. Miller, we've confirmed all the inconsistencies pointed out by Miss Mendez. The duplication of the industrial warehouse reduces the liability by $8 million. The inclusion of the public school contract adds $17 million in guaranteed revenue. The paid-off machinery reduces the liability by $3.5 million. Additionally, we found 2 more incorrect reclassifications that, while smaller, add up to $1.2 million in favorable adjustments. Robert did the math in his head, his brain finally working with the clarity it had lost in recent months. Almost $30 million of difference between the real balance sheet and what was in the bankruptcy documents. It was a complete paradigm shift. It didn't turn crisis into prosperity, but it turned impossible into challenging. Frank Sullivan, who had maintained his serious expression all morning, finally allowed a small smile. With these corrected numbers, Robert, you not only have viability for Chapter 11, but a relatively strong case. Your company isn't on the verge of collapse. It's in trouble, yes, but it's a surmountable difficulty with proper management. Henry, who had spent the last hour on the phone with the court that handled bankruptcy cases, hung up and rejoined the group. I've secured an emergency hearing for tomorrow at 9 a.m. We'll present these findings and request an immediate withdrawal of the bankruptcy petition. Simultaneously, we'll file for Chapter 11 protection. He looked at Robert seriously. Are you sure about this, Robert? Chapter 11 is a long and painful process. It will require total transparency, constant accountability, and you'll be living under the court's scrutiny for up to 2 years. Robert didn't hesitate. I'd rather have 2 years of fighting with a chance to win than sign my defeat today. He looked around the table at all the people who, in their own way, had contributed to this moment. I'm ready to do whatever it takes. Marianne, who had remained quiet during the presentation of the numbers, finally spoke. And what about your personal life, Robert? Are you going to be able to do this and still have time to be a father to Isabella, to rebuild some kind of relationship with your daughter? Her voice held no accusation, just genuine concern and perhaps a trace of hope. Robert felt the weight of that question. It was the question that mattered, perhaps more than all the others. What was the point of saving the company if he permanently lost his daughter in the process? He looked at Marianne, really looked, perhaps for the first time in months, and saw not the resentful ex-wife, but the worried mother and the partner of 2 decades who just wanted him to find balance. I'm going to try, Marianne, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I know that's not much. I know I've promised this before and failed. But this time is different. This time I almost lost everything, and it showed me what really matters. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I'm not asking for us to get back together. I know that ship has sailed, but I am asking for a chance to be a present father to Isabella, to prove that I've learned my lesson. Marianne wiped away a tear that insisted on falling. She's going to need to see actions, Robert, not words. Isabella is at a difficult age. She's hurt, and it won't be easy to win her back. But I think she deserves to have her father back. The real father, not the workaholic ghost you became. I know, Robert admitted. And I'm going to do things differently. I'll set boundaries, I'll delegate, I'll trust the team. He looked at Julia. And I'll have someone whose specific job is to warn me when I'm slipping back into the old patterns. Julia smiled softly. Part of the job description, then? Telling the boss when he's being an idiot? Essentially, Robert. Confirmed, and for the first time in months he laughed. It was a small, almost shy laugh, but it was genuine. The others at the table joined in, and for a moment, the tension that had dominated the morning dissipated a little. Mr. Benedict approached, carrying a tray of fresh pastries. On the house, he announced, to celebrate the bakery becoming the scene of a corporate miracle. He winked at Julia. And to celebrate discovering I have a financial genius on my staff, although from what I understand I'm about to lose her. Julia blushed. Mr. Benedict, I need to give my 2 weeks' notice. I can't just walk out on the job here. The old baker waved his hand, dismissing the concern. My dear, you just saved a multi-million-dollar company. I think your 2 weeks' notice is waived. Besides, he lowered his voice conspiratorially, you were always too good to be just serving coffee. I knew your talent would be recognized one day. The generosity of the gesture visibly touched Julia. She hugged Mr. Benedict, thanking him for months of patience and kindness. Robert watched the scene and realized something important. Julia wasn't just technically competent, she was a good person, the kind of person who inspired loyalty and affection, even in a simple job like a bakery server. That was rare and valuable. Frank began organizing the documents into separate folders, creating order out of the chaos of papers. I'm going to need full access to the company's accounting, Robert. Every bank account, every contract, every receipt. Everything needs to be transparent if we're going to build a solid case for Chapter 11. You'll have it, Robert promised. Julia will coordinate it on our end. He looked at her. If you officially accept the position, I want you to start immediately. Tomorrow. Your first task is to conduct a full audit of everything we have. I want to know every penny that comes in and goes out, every real asset we own, every true debt we owe. No surprises, no hidden mistakes. Julia nodded, and Robert saw in her the transformation from bakery server back to the professional she truly was. Her posture changed. Her eyes gained a different focus. "I'll need access to the systems, passwords, and the authority to question anything without going through bureaucratic filters." "You'll have a blank check," Robert confirmed. "You report directly." "To me, no intermediaries. If you find something wrong, I want to know immediately, no matter how inconvenient or embarrassing it is." He looked around the table. "In fact, that goes for everyone. The era of unchecked errors ended today." Henry closed his briefcase with a decisive snap. "Then it's settled. Tomorrow at 9 a.m. we present the case to the judge. Robert, you'll need to be there, as will Miss Mendez, since she was the one who discovered the inconsistencies. Her credibility will be important." Julia frowned, worried. "But my history, the previous accusations, won't that hurt the case? The opposing counsel will use it against me." "On the contrary," Frank intervened, "you weren't in a position of responsibility when you found these errors. You were literally serving coffee. That makes your discovery even more compelling, not less. It shows the errors were so obvious that even an outsider with minimal access to the documents could identify them." He smiled. "Your past might even help the narrative. A wronged professional who found redemption by saving a company." The afternoon wore on, and the bakery began to fill with the lunch crowd. The group decided to move to Henry's office to finalize preparations for the next day's hearing. But before they left, Robert asked for a moment alone with Julia. The two of them remained at the table while the others began to gather their things. "Julia," Robert began, his voice softer now that they were relatively alone. "I need to know. Why did you really do it? Don't give me the nice answer about wishing someone had checked your work. Tell me the truth." Julia looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Because when I saw you here this morning, alone at that table with that look of absolute defeat, I saw my own reflection. I saw the day I signed my termination papers, the day the judge denied my appeal, the day I realized I had lost everything for doing the right thing." Her voice trembled slightly. "And I thought, if I had had a second chance, a single person who believed in me, maybe things would be different. So when I saw the errors in your documents, I realized I could be that person for you. I could give you the second chance that no one gave me." Robert felt a lump in his throat. "But I gave you that second chance too, didn't I? By offering you the job." Julia smiled, and there were tears in her eyes. "Yes. I think we saved each other today, Mr. Miller. You gave me back my professional dignity, my chance to use my talents for something more than serving coffee. And I gave you back your company, your chance to do things right this time." Robert extended his hand, but instead of a formal shake, he pulled her into a hug. It was inappropriate, perhaps, so early in their professional relationship, but it felt like the only fitting response to the magnitude of what had happened between them. Julia hesitated for only a moment before returning the embrace. When they separated, Robert wiped his own eyes without shame. "We're going to make this work," he said with conviction. "Not just the company. We're going to fix our lives. We're going to prove that people like us who have fallen and gotten hurt can still get up and win." Julia nodded, her own voice choked with emotion. "We'll set an example that no matter how far you fall, there's always a chance to come back. There's always someone who can see your worth when you can't see it yourself anymore." The hearing the next day was intense but decisive. Judge Charles H. Monroe, a 60-year-old man known for his strictness and attention to detail, listened intently to the presentation by Henry and Frank. The courtroom was filled with creditors, lawyers representing banks, and a few journalists who had sniffed out an interesting story. Robert sat between his lawyers, with Julia by his side, both dressed in formal attire that contrasted with their casual meeting at the bakery the day before. When it was Julia's turn to present her findings, a murmur went through the room. A former bakery server exposing errors in documents prepared by renowned firms. It sounded like the plot of an unlikely movie. But when she began to speak, methodically explaining each inconsistency with technical clarity and impressive precision, the initial skepticism gave way to respect. She not only pointed out the errors, but explained how and why they had occurred, demonstrating a deep understanding of auditing processes and accounting classifications. The creditor's lawyer tried to discredit her, mentioning her firing for cause and the accusations in her past. But Julia maintained her composure, responding with dignity that her findings could be independently verified, that the numbers spoke for themselves, and that her personal history didn't change the basic math of an audit. The judge, clearly impressed, ordered an immediate independent verification by court-appointed experts. 3 hours later, the experts confirmed everything. Every comma, every number Julia had pointed out was correct. Judge Monroe looked at Robert with an expression that mixed severity with something that could be interpreted as respect. "Mr. Miller, for the first time in 20 years on the bench, I am seeing a bankruptcy case completely reversed by such grotesque administrative errors. This is simultaneously alarming for the negligence shown and admirable for the diligence of Miss Mendez." The bankruptcy petition was officially withdrawn. In its place, a Chapter 11 restructuring process was approved with specific conditions: an independent monthly audit, quarterly reports to the court, and the retention of Julia Mendez as Director of Financial Integrity. The judge was clear. If not for her intervention, an economic injustice would have been committed, destroying a viable company and hundreds of jobs through sheer administrative incompetence. When they left the courthouse that afternoon, Robert felt as if he had undergone life or death surgery and survived. He was exhausted, emotionally drained but alive, and for the first time in months he could see a future that wasn't just darkness. Marianne was waiting outside the courthouse. Isabella was with her. Robert felt his heart clench at the sight of his 14-year-old daughter, who had barely looked at him for months. Isabella was tall for her age, with her mother's brown hair and his dark eyes. She was wearing a school uniform and had an uncertain posture, as if she wasn't sure why she was there. "Hi, honey," Robert said softly, approaching slowly as if afraid to startle her. "It's good to see you." Isabella shifted her weight from one foot to the other, clearly uncomfortable. "Mom said you almost lost everything, that you almost destroyed the company." The accusation in her words was clear, but there was something else too. Concern, perhaps, or fear of losing him completely. "Almost," Robert admitted, not trying to hide or minimize it. "But I didn't. Thanks to a lot of people, especially Julia here," he gestured to the new director, "I was able to see the mistakes before it was too late." Isabella looked at Julia with curiosity. "You're the lady from the bakery, the one my mum told me about?" Julia extended her hand with a gentle smile. "I am. Julia Mendez. It's a pleasure to meet you, Isabella." Isabella shook her hand shyly. "My mum said you were smart, that you saw things no one else saw. Is that true?" "It's complicated," Julia answered honestly. "I had the advantage of looking with fresh eyes, without the biases of someone who had been too close to the problem for too long. Sometimes the solution is right in front of us, but we need an outsider to point it out." Marianne put a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Isabella, your father wants to talk to you. He has something important to say." She looked at Robert with an encouraging nod. "You two go on. I'll wait here." Robert and Isabella walked to a bench in the square across from the courthouse. The afternoon sun painted New York in golden hues, and the noise of the traffic created a familiar urban soundtrack. They sat with a space between them, a physical distance that mirrored the emotional one. "Isabella," Robert began, his voice thick with emotion, "I messed everything up. Not just the company, but our family. I neglected you, I neglected your mother, and I threw away the most important things in my life chasing professional success. And I almost lost everything because of it." Isabella kept her eyes fixed on the ground. "Why did you do it, Dad? Why was the company more important than me?" The question pierced Robert's heart like a sharp blade. "It wasn't, honey. It never was. I just got lost along the way. I convinced myself that working hard was my way of taking care of you, of ensuring a secure future. But I forgot that you needed me to be present, not just a provider." He took a deep breath. "I have no excuse, Isabella. Only deep regret and the will to do things differently." "How are you going to be different?" Isabella's voice held a painful skepticism, typical of someone who has been disappointed many times. You always say you're going to change, but you never do. Robert knew she was right. Words were empty without actions to back them up. This time will be different, because I almost lost everything, honey. I almost signed away the company yesterday, and that experience woke me up. It made me realize that professional success means nothing if I don't have you and the people I love to share it with. He looked directly into his daughter's eyes. I'm going to set boundaries. I'm going to delegate more. I'm going to trust my team. And I'm going to set aside sacred time for you no matter what's happening at the company. Isabella finally looked at him, and there were tears in her eyes. I just wanted my dad back, she said, her voice breaking. Not the important businessman, not the man who builds skyscrapers. Just my dad. Robert couldn't hold back. He pulled her into a tight hug, and Isabella, after a moment of stiffness, gave in and hugged him back. They both cried there on that bench, releasing months of hurt, distance, and pain. You have your dad back, Robert whispered. I promise, honey, and this time I'll keep it. When they finally separated, wiping away their tears, Isabella gave a small, shy smile. So you really almost went bankrupt because of spreadsheet errors? That sounds like something out of a cartoon. Robert laughed, the sound light and genuine. I know, right? Life is sometimes more absurd than fiction. But you know what I learned? That pride and stubbornness almost destroyed me. If I had been humble enough to double-check everything, to ask for help, to admit I wasn't seeing clearly, I might have avoided this near catastrophe. And that lady, Julia, Isabella said thoughtfully, she had nothing to gain by helping you. Why did she do it? Because she understands what it's like to fall and have no one to help you up, Robert explained. She went through it, lost everything for doing the right thing, and she wanted to be for me what no one was for her. It's a lesson about empathy, about using our painful experiences to help others. Isabella nodded slowly, processing. I think she's cool, and I think it's cool that you gave her a job. It shows you can learn and change. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Julia dove headfirst into a full audit of Miller Construction, working 16-hour days to map out every financial aspect of the company. She found more small inconsistencies, none as dramatic as those in the bankruptcy petition, but enough to show that internal controls had been lax for a long time. Robert, true to his word, gave her complete autonomy to question, investigate, and reorganize. Horizon Builders confirmed their interest in the joint venture for the Bronx property. Negotiations moved quickly, and a contract was signed within 3 weeks. The development project would begin in 2 months, bringing not only immediate capital, but also the prospect of significant future profits. The creditors, initially hostile, began to soften when they saw the seriousness of the recovery plan. The negotiations were tough, but the public school contract, which guaranteed a steady cash flow, gave Robert bargaining power he hadn't had before. One by one, agreements were reached, restructuring debts on more favorable terms. 3 months after that day at the bakery, Robert was in his renovated office when Julia walked in with a report. She had transformed completely, back in the corporate world, but now with a confidence tested by fire. We have good news, she announced with a smile. The quarterly cash flow was positive for the first time in a year, and I managed to renegotiate the last problematic debt. We are officially on a path to sustainable recovery. Robert stood up and hugged Julia, a gesture that had become common between them, more like family than boss and employee. None of this would have been possible without you, he said sincerely. You didn't just save the company, you saved me. We saved each other, Julia corrected gently. You gave me the chance no one else would. You gave me back my career, my dignity. We're partners in this, Robert. That evening, Robert left the office at 6 p.m., something unthinkable in the old days. He had promised to have dinner with Isabella, just the two of them. No phone, no laptop, no work distractions. When he arrived, at the restaurant she had chosen, he found his daughter already waiting, and the smile she gave him was worth more than any multi-million-dollar contract. During dinner, Isabella talked about school, her friends, the science project she was working on. Robert listened, really listened, asking questions and showing genuine interest. At the end of the night, when he dropped her off at home with Marianne, Isabella hugged him tightly. "Thanks for being here, Dad," she whispered. "Thanks for keeping your promise." Robert drove back to his apartment with a full heart. The road ahead was still long. The Chapter 11 process would take months, maybe years, to be fully completed. But he was no longer walking in darkness. There was light at the end of the tunnel, and he had people by his side helping him get there. 1 year after that day at the corner bakery, Robert organized a small celebration. Miller Construction was officially out of Chapter 11, all creditors paid, the company restructured and profitable again. But more important than the numbers, Robert had rebuilt his personal life. Isabella was there, now 15 and much closer to her father. Marianne came too, bringing her new boyfriend, a history professor whom Robert genuinely liked. There was no bitterness between them, only mutual respect and gratitude that they had managed to maintain a healthy relationship for their daughter's sake. Julia was radiant, promoted to full CFO, her story of redemption becoming an inspiration in the industry. She had given talks at universities about corporate ethics and internal controls, turning her painful past into lessons for others. Henry and Frank were present, along with the teams that had worked on the recovery. And Mr. Benedict was also invited, bringing a tray of bagels that, he claimed, were the same kind Robert had eaten on that fateful morning. Robert called for attention and raised his glass. "Exactly 1 year ago, I was sitting in a bakery about to make the biggest mistake of my life. I was blinded by despair, deaf to the signs that there was hope, and determined to destroy everything I had built." He looked at Julia. But one person who had nothing to gain, who was serving coffee to survive, had the courage to stop me, to show me I was wrong. And in doing so, she didn't just save a company, she saved the hundreds of the families who depend on the jobs we create. And she saved me from myself. Julia blushed but smiled. Robert continued, "I learned that pride is dangerous, that asking for help isn't weakness, and that solutions don't always come from the places we expect. I learned that numbers on a balance sheet don't define success, but the relationships we build do." He looked at Isabella. "And I learned that no professional achievement is worth losing the people we love." Everyone applauded. Isabella wiped away a tear, proud of her father. Marianne nodded, acknowledging the genuine transformation. And Julia, the woman who, a year ago, was serving coffee because no one else would hire her, now stood there as a respected professional and a dear friend. When the celebration ended and everyone had gone home, Robert stood alone for a moment in his office. He looked out the windows at the illuminated New York City skyline. How many other people, at that very moment, were about to make irreversible mistakes? How many were blinded by despair, by pressure, by a loss of perspective? He took out his cell phone and sent a text to Julia. "Thank you for everything, not just for the company, but for reminding me that it's always worth checking the numbers again, that it's always worth getting a second opinion, and that it's never too late to change course." The reply came quickly. "My pleasure. And thank you for giving me a chance to start over. Sometimes we need someone to believe in us when we no longer believe in ourselves." Robert put his phone away and smiled. The journey had been difficult, almost impossible at times. But in the end, he had found not only the salvation of his company, but the redemption of his life. And it was all because, at a crucial moment, he had chosen to listen instead of sign, to question instead of accept, and to trust a stranger who would become one of the most important people in his reconstruction. Miller Construction began to grow again, but this time in a sustainable and balanced way. Robert never worked on weekends again, never missed another dinner with Isabella, and never made another major decision without a thorough and careful review. And on the wall of his office, in a simple frame, he kept a napkin from the corner bakery, its logo faded but visible, reminding him of where everything almost ended and where everything truly began again. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Robert and Julia has touched your hearts. It's a powerful reminder that redemption is possible, that second chances exist, and that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places. If this narrative resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that like button. Every day, we bring you unique stories that explore the complexity of life, the challenges we face, and the strength we discover when we least expect it. And in the comments, we want to know, have you ever had a moment when someone unexpected changed the course of your life? Share your story with us. Don't miss our upcoming content, where we'll continue to explore the emotional twists and turns of life. Until the next story, and always remember, it's never too late to question, to review, and to start over.